The morning air was filled with the acrid smoke of distant artillery, a metallic taste that had become as familiar to the skeletal figures behind the barbed wire as their breath. The snow fell in lazy spirals, each flake disintegrating instantly upon touching the muddy ground, trampled by thousands of feet over 4 brutal years. In Block 32, 67 women huddled on wooden boards that served as their beds. Their breath formed small clouds in the icy air. Their eyes, hollowed by months of hunger, followed the guards' every move with the instinctive wariness of prey. But on this morning, something unprecedented was about to happen. Something so simple, so primally human, that it would shatter the carefully constructed myth of Nazi superiority and reveal the profound power of basic human dignity. The sound that would change everything began as a distant rumble, grew louder and louder, and finally became unmistakable. The deep, rhythmic rumble of American Sherman tanks approaching from the west. Yet it wasn't the tanks themselves that would inflict the greatest damage on Nazi ideology. It was what followed them. 3 American Red Cross trucks, their white paint striking against the winter landscape, carried something more powerful than any weapon. Bars of soap, bottles of perfume, and clean towels. In the hands of the liberating troops, these simple objects became instruments of resurrection, transforming broken souls and revealing the fundamental bankruptcy of a regime that had sought to reduce people to mere numbers. The Nazi leadership had built its empire on calculated dehumanization. They believed that systematic humiliation would break the spirit of their victims so completely that resistance would become impossible. Heinrich Himmler himself had declared in his secret speech to the SS leadership in Posen that the extermination of entire populations was necessary to cleanse Europe. The concentration camp system was designed not only to kill, but also to deprive victims of any modicum of human dignity before their death. To reinforce the Nazi claim that certain people were inherently inferior and unworthy of basic human consideration. Personal hygiene, the most fundamental aspect of self-respect, was deliberately used as a weapon against the prisoners. Soap was withheld, bathing was forbidden, and the resulting deterioration in appearance was used as proof of the victim's supposedly subhuman nature. German guards, indoctrinated since childhood with the mythology of Aryan supremacy, entered the camps expecting to encounter the monsters their propaganda had promised. They had been told they would find creatures so degraded and inherently vile that eliminating them would be more an act of purification than murder. The systematic denial of basic hygiene was a central component of this psychological manipulation of both victims and perpetrators. By forcing people to live in conditions of deliberate filth, the Nazi system created visual confirmation of its own twisted ideology. The guards could see the unwashed, desperate figures before them and in them, confirmation of everything they had learned about racial hierarchy and human dignity. Dr. Miklos Nisli, a Hungarian doctor forced to work at Auschwitz, documented in his secret diary how even the medical staff were conditioned to view the prisoners as less than human. The German doctors spoke of us as if they were laboratory animals, he wrote in careful handwriting, hiding his observations in a cavity in his bunk. They were convinced that we felt no pain, experienced no emotions, and deserved no consideration. This dehumanization was so pervasive that many guards actually believed they were doing humanity a service by eliminating what they considered a scourge of civilization, but the ideology, however carefully constructed, could not withstand the sheer power of restored human dignity. When the first American soldiers marched into Ravensbrück that January morning, They brought with them not only military might, but also a completely different understanding of human dignity. Captain Robert Morrison of the 82nd Airborne Division, a farmer's son from Iowa, later wrote to his wife about what he had experienced. "Mary, I cannot describe to you the change these women experienced when we gave them soap. It was as if we had given them back pieces of their souls." The transformation began with the smallest gestures. When Sergeant William Thompson, a former barber from Detroit, offered a Polish woman named Christina Dziewulska a bar of ivory soap, she stared at it for a full minute before reaching for it with trembling fingers. The soap was white, clean, and faintly scented with the familiar American fragrance that hadn't been in her world for 3 years. She held it to her nose and inhaled deeply. Tears streamed down her cheeks as, for the first time in years, she smelled a scent that spoke of normalcy, of a world where such simple luxuries were taken for granted. The news spread through the barracks like lightning. Women who had barely spoken to each other in months whispered to each other, sharing the impossible news that the Americans had brought soap, not the caustic, skin-stinging substitute the Germans had occasionally supplied, but real soap, soft and white and scented with flowers. In Block 15, Maria Stromberger, an Austrian nurse imprisoned for helping Jewish families escape, clutched a small bottle of Evening in Paris like the most precious jewel in the world. Mass-produced in American factories and sold in discount stores throughout the Midwest, the fragrance represented something infinitely more valuable than its modest price suggested. It embodied the idea that beauty, pleasure, and human dignity were not privileges to be earned, but a birthright to be cherished. The German guards watched this transformation with growing unease. Their carefully cultivated worldview was shattered as they witnessed these supposedly subhuman creatures transforming before their very eyes. Women who had previously shuffled through their daily lives with the mechanical movements of the defeated now stood more erect, moved purposefully, and, most disturbing of all, began to smile. This smile was not an expression of gratitude to their captors, but something far more threatening. It was an expression of an inner strength that had never truly been broken, merely hidden beneath layers of enforced humiliation. Private Hans Müller, a 19-year-old guard from Bavaria who had never questioned his training, was deeply disturbed by what he observed. In a letter he later wrote from an American POW camp, he described his confusion. "They became human again before my eyes. I had been told they were animals, but when they washed and perfumed themselves, they looked like my mother, my sisters. I began to understand that everything I had been taught was a lie." This realization shook his entire worldview, but it also marked his first step towards salvation. Soap became more than just a cleansing agent. It became a symbol of resurrection. Women shared precious pieces with each other and created elaborate systems to give everyone access to this miracle of human dignity. They organized washing schedules, carefully rationed perfume, so everyone could experience even a drop of its transformative power, and helped each other restore a part of their former selves. The act of washing became ritualistic, almost sacred, a reclamation of the humanity that had been systematically lost. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the commander of the Liberation Unit, documented the scene in his official report. The effect of providing basic hygiene items exceeded all expectations. Physical appearance improved dramatically within a few hours, but more importantly, we observed a complete transformation in morale, behavior, and self-esteem. These people, who had been placed in extremely desperate circumstances, regained their basic humanity with remarkable speed and dignity. His matter-of-fact military language could hardly describe the emotional impact of what he had experienced. For years, the German propaganda machine had convinced both perpetrators and victims that humiliation was final, that some people were inherently inferior and could never rise above their circumstances. But the mere provision of soap and perfume completely shattered this myth. The prisoners' rapid transformation proved that their degrading condition had been artificially induced and not inherently earned. The guards, confronted with this proof of their victims' basic humanity, could no longer maintain the psychological distance that had made their cruelty possible. Dr. Elisabeth Kohler, a German doctor who had been forced to work in the camp's medical facility, later testified at the Nuremberg trials about the psychological effects on the German staff. When the American relief supplies arrived, many of my colleagues were visibly distressed. The prisoners' transformation challenged everything we had been told about racial studies and human nature. Several guards immediately demanded a transfer. They could not reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. Perfume, in particular, held great symbolic significance. In Nazi ideology, the ideal of beauty, the desire for pleasant scents, and the cultivation of personal aesthetics were considered signs of racial superiority, traits supposedly exclusively attributable to the Aryan ideal. Yet here were the supposedly inferior prisoners, responding to beauty with precisely the same joy, appreciation, and innate understanding that their captors considered their exclusive heritage. A Polish woman named Helena Plotting later recalled, "When I smelled the perfume, I remembered who I was before this place. I remember dancing with my husband, getting ready for church, and feeling pretty. They had tried to make me forget I was a woman, but the perfume brought it all back. The American soldiers, many of them young men who had never traveled beyond their homelands before the war, had unconscious assumptions about human nature that proved more accurate than the elaborate racial theories of their enemies. They distributed soap and perfume not because they had studied the prisoners and determined they deserved it, but because they instinctively understood that all people are entitled to a basic human right. This intuitive egalitarianism, rooted in American democratic ideals rather than scientific theories, proved far closer to reality than the carefully constructed hierarchies of Nazi ideology. Corporal James Washington, an African-American soldier from Mississippi who himself experienced discrimination, later wrote in his memoirs about the profound irony he observed. Here were these Germans who thought they were so superior, but who hadn't the slightest idea of what makes people human. We simply treated these women like human beings, like any other mothers or daughters, and that was enough to prove that everything the Nazis believed was wrong. The impact of this simple act of human kindness reached far beyond the immediate recipients. Other prisoners in the camp also heard about the soap and perfume and began to believe, for the first time in years, that their ordeal might finally be over. The mere existence of such supplies hinted at a world beyond the camps, where such things were commonplace, where human dignity was assumed, not earned. The news spread through the underground networks that connected the various prisoner groups and contained a message, more powerful than any communication. From the resistance, there was still humanity. Beyond the barbed wire fence, the transformation wasn't merely cosmetic. As the women cleansed themselves, enjoyed the pleasures of pleasant scents, contemplated their reflections in the American small mirrors, and saw themselves as people rather than numbers, their behavior changed dramatically. They began to speak more frequently, make eye contact with each other and their liberators, and move with something resembling self-confidence. The psychological shield they had developed to survive dehumanization began to disintegrate. replaced by the natural dignity that had always reigned beneath the surface. Captain Morrison recorded a particularly poignant moment in his diary. "Today I watched a woman named Sophia looking at herself in the mirror. She said it was the first time she had done so in 3 years. She had cleansed her face and applied only a tiny bit of perfume. When she saw her reflection, she smiled. Not at me or the other soldiers, but at herself. In that smile, I recognized the utter failure of everything the Nazi system had tried to achieve. They hadn't broken her spirit. They had merely temporarily hidden it. Soap and perfume became charms of hope throughout the camp. Women who had received their share described in detail how it felt to be clean again, to smell of flowers instead of despair and fear. These descriptions took on the character of prayers, reminding everyone of a world where such simple joys were a birthright, not unattainable dreams. Simply sharing these experiences forged bonds between women, isolated by trauma and fear, rebuilding the social connections essential to human mental health. German nurses and guards were particularly shocked by this transformation. They had been told that their victims were fundamentally different from themselves, that German women possessed a fundamental nobility and a sense of beauty that others lacked. Yet they saw Jewish, Polish, Roma, and political prisoners respond to perfume and soap with the same joy they themselves had felt. Brunhilde Pomsel, a young German nurse assigned to the camp, later wrote, "I realized that if we had been swapped, I would have looked just like them, desperate, dirty, broken, and they, given the same opportunities, would have looked just like me. This realization destroyed everything I thought I knew about the world." The American abundance that made such gifts possible became its own form of propaganda, more effective than any carefully crafted message. The natural generosity with which the soldiers distributed soap and perfume, things that were luxuries for the prisoners but commonplace for their liberators, demonstrated the fundamental prosperity and humane nature of democratic society. These young Americans, many from humble beginnings, could afford to give away apparent treasures to people who had been denied the most basic necessities. Sergeant Major Robert Kowalski, whose parents had emigrated from Poland before his birth, felt a special connection to the women in the camp. He later wrote, "My mother always said that cleanliness was humanity. No matter how poor we were, we could always wash our faces, comb our hair, and hold our heads high. When I saw what had been taken from these women, I understood what my mother meant. The soap wasn't just soap. It gave them back their humanity." Faced with this psychological revolution, the German camp administration attempted to maintain control through increasingly desperate measures. Commandant Fritz Sören ordered the confiscation of the American supplies, but his guards, many of whom had witnessed the transformation firsthand, carried out these orders only half-heartedly. Some secretly allowed the women to keep their soap. Others looked the other way when small amounts of perfume were distributed. The myth that sustained their cruelty crumbled, and with it their attachment to the system that had created the camps. Dr. Percy Treat, the chief camp physician, noted in his private diary the rapid improvement in the prisoners' health after the distribution of hygiene items. "The psychological boost appears to have strengthened their immune systems," he wrote. "Several women, whose condition was rapidly deteriorating, showed marked improvements simply because they were able to wash properly again. The connection between dignity and physical health is stronger than we grasped in our medical training." His clinical observations, intended for the Nazi medical authorities, inadvertently documented the complete failure of their dehumanization strategy. Perfume, in particular, created moments of transcendence that the camp system could neither contain nor control. Women closed their eyes and breathed deeply, momentarily transported to memories of better times. Wedding anniversaries, celebrations, quiet moments of self-care that once seemed insignificant, but now felt immeasurably valuable. These moments of sensory recollection created psychological spaces that existed beyond the reach of their captors, proving that the human spirit could find ways to survive and even thrive even under the most oppressive conditions. Ruth Elias, a Czech Jew imprisoned for 18 months, later described her experience. "When I smelled that perfume, I was suddenly back in my grandmother's bedroom, watching her getting ready for synagogue on Friday nights. I could see her silver hairbrush, her beautiful dress lying on the bed, the way she dabbed perfume behind her ears and smiled at herself in the mirror. For a brief moment, I was not prisoner 47291. I was Ruth, the granddaughter of Sarah, heir to generations of women who were proud of themselves and their appearance. The Nazis could not touch that memory, could not steal that identity. The systematic documentation of these transformations by American military personnel created a historical document that would prove invaluable for post-war trials and educational efforts." Lieutenant William Bradley, a former journalism student, conducted informal interviews with prisoners and guards and compiled a detailed account of how quickly and comprehensively the provision of basic goods to ensure human dignity had undermined Nazi racial theory. His reports, submitted to military intelligence, provided evidence later used to prosecute war, criminals, and educate the world about the dehumanizing methods of totalitarian regimes. The reactions of the German guards varied considerably, depending on their individual backgrounds and the intensity of their indoctrination. Younger guards, who had no other system, often experienced a complete psychological crisis as their worldview collapsed. Older guards, who remembered pre-Nazi Germany, sometimes experienced a kind of awakening, remembering their own humanity and the moral standards they had been forced to abandon. A few, too closely connected to the Nazi system to acknowledge its failures, became increasingly agitated and demanded a transfer outside the camp. Otto Moll, a senior guard who oversaw daily life in the women's barracks, later testified to his growing unease. "I was taught that these people were dangerous and would poison German society if they were allowed to survive. But when they cleaned themselves and applied the American perfume, they looked like people I might have known in my village before the war. They looked like neighbors, like shopkeepers, like the women who sang in my church choir. I began to question everything I had been told. Soap itself became a medium of communication and resistance. Women carved small messages into the bars, creating tiny works of art that expressed their hope and determination. They developed ingenious sharing systems to ensure that even the most vulnerable among them had access to this precious resource. The communal washing places became centers of whispered conversations, places where women could speak freely about their dreams of liberation and their plans for rebuilding their lives. The American chaplain Father Michael O'Brien, who witnessed many of these transformations, wrote in his spiritual journal, "I saw the resurrection of the human spirit manifested in the simple act of washing their faces. These women,